very much. Good afternoon. I know you've had a lot of data thrown at you today, a lot of information, and it's a very complex and very difficult issue fraught with dilemmas, I think, this whole question of eating less meat. And as a meat lover myself, I try to keep it down, but I do recognise that it's a very hard thing to countenance, this idea that we all need to change our diets. But we do. It's very important that we eat less meat. And I'm going to begin with just a couple of charts going right back up to the top and explaining why. And explaining why we need to take a systemic view on this, not just to look at the way that we produce what we consume, but to ask ourselves, are we consuming the right things, and are we handling the things that we consume in the right kind of way, and what do we need to do to change? So I'll move on to talk a little bit about what the impacts of food consumption are, if you haven't heard enough of that already. And finally, to talk about some of the responses and priorities that I believe we as a society should be placing, and what we can expect from our politicians. So forgive the very bad graphics, but I think the problem here is that our consumption of food, of fossil fuels, of many of the things that we consider essential for daily life is actually eating up our own planet. If this room were full of bankers, I'd be talking about principles and loans, and everybody has savings. What we are doing is we are spending our savings. We are not living off the interest that those savings accrue. And if you look at this chart here, WWF produces every year something called the Living Planet Report, and there are two really key charts in there. The first one shows our global ecological footprint. So this is a measure, if you divided up everything that we consume and allocated a parcel of land to it, how much land or other resources like atmosphere would be required. And that little dotted line that you see running along the middle there, that represents one Earth. So in 1961, we were consuming about 60% of all of the resources that the Earth can renew within a single year. Now, come the middle of September, we've already used up all of the resources that the planet can provide to us in 1 year. So we're 50% above sustainability at a planetary level. And at the same time, and of course closely linked to that, we are in the midst of one of the great mass extinctions this planet has ever known. We have lost 30% of the biodiversity on this planet in just 40 years. And in the tropics, we're talking about 60% declines in biodiversity. That is completely uncountenanceable, if that's a word. I mean, that just cannot continue. If it does, we won't have anything to eat, and we won't have anything to fuel our economy. Food is one of the three greatest impacts on our environment. This chart shows the share of food and other areas of consumption in terms of our global ecological footprints. And housing's a big one, slightly bigger than food, according to this chart. Transport is smaller. Food is the second, some say the most demanding product, ecologically speaking, that we produce. 23% of our global ecological footprint, and by the way, about the same amount of our greenhouse gas footprint. In fact, if you look at the UK's emissions related to what we consume, not just what we produce locally, but what we import from abroad, and you take into account the land use change, clearing of forests, for example, to support the meat and other products that we eat, that figure goes up from 20% of carbon emissions to 30% of carbon emissions. And within the food chain, all the way from primary production all the way through to consumption, agriculture accounts for 40% of those impacts. Which doesn't mean that we should just focus on production, by the way, because what we consume multiplies each one of those impacts. And as we've heard today, meat and dairy really are the primary concern here. They account for 60 to 80% of direct agricultural impacts, around 3/4 of all the land use change in the world. We've heard about 1 kilogram of beef taking up so much water and so much more carbon dioxide than plant-based materials. It takes up a lot more land as well, because you have to spread the cows out and the other animals out. And 80% of the world's soya is consumed by animals. Now, what does this mean, practically speaking, on the ground? It means that Biodiverse habitats like this, the Cerrado do Brasil, which contains 5% of the world's biodiversity, is being turned quite rapidly into landscapes that look like this. This is intensive soya production, and it is there essentially to feed our insatiable appetite for meat and for dairy products, because this grain is fed to cows, and it is fed to pigs, and it is fed to chickens. So we are responsible for taking up about 400 square meters of this land ourselves every year. This is the Cerrado as it was a few decades ago only. And this is what it looks like today. And we're still talking about 5% of the world's biodiversity. So imagine the destruction that we have wrought up until now. We have to stop that destruction. And we have to ask ourselves, are the diets that we aspire to and have become used to eating in rich industrialized nations like our own the way forward? This is a typical American family, what they consume within a week. It is absolutely loaded with processed foods and with meats. Now, I don't personally subscribe to the view that the reason poor people start eating more meat when they get rich is because they want to be like Americans or like British. I just think, it's a luxury part of every culture. When you get rich, it's a status symbol, it's something you consider very special. You eat more of it. Of course you do. And as the world gets richer, as we grow our population to 9 billion people, and as average incomes set to rise, our impact is going to rise accordingly. If we do move towards these high meat diets like we have in the West, if the whole of the world does that, we're going to need more like 3 planets to support us, rather than the 1.5 or so that we're currently eating our way through. But if we are prepared to switch to diets more like they have in Malaysia, which is much lower in processed food, in meat and in dairy products, we can get ourselves back down more like to 1 planet living. We did a study recently in association with the Food Climate Research Network that actually ran scenarios looking at, looking at the different solutions, efficient use of energy, changing the way that we consume, changing production methods, changing the way we generate electricity. And we asked, to what extent could each of these scenarios lead us towards 70% reductions in carbon emissions by 2050, which is what we believe are required? And the fact is, you can't lose any of them, really. You've got to do all of them. And consumption, which at the moment really is an unmentionable word across the Atlantic, if not quite so much here, we've got to start thinking about it. So where should we focus our priorities? Well, obviously, we have to eliminate waste. I mean, we waste up to 40% of the food. That is ridiculous. And by the way, the spoilage of food is one of the reasons why famines occur. I also have been to Ethiopia, and I've seen what happens straight after the harvest. There is an abundance of food. The problem is that a few months down the line, without refrigeration, without decent transport to take that food to market, it's gone, and people begin to starve. We need to eliminate waste completely, because we need to mimic nature, and there is no waste in nature. Secondly, we have got to reduce our meat and dairy consumption. We need to avoid processed meats, which are much worse for the environment and much worse for health. And we need to eat locally in season fruits and vegetables, far greater proportion of those in our diets. Reducing meat and dairy consumption, particularly intensively produced, imported and processed meats. Consumers are going to find this very hard. Consumers are not going to change their diets, however much we might want them to, without a lot of help. They need to have the right products available to them on the supermarket shelves. They need to be responsibly produced. They need to be clearly labelled. They need to be appropriately priced. And by appropriately priced, I mean the true cost of producing these foods should be reflected in the end price. They need guidance on how to choose it, buy it, store it, cooking it. Up to half of the carbon emissions go in cooking the food. And we need some political leadership. We have to force our politicians, or vote in politicians, who are prepared to face up to these very obvious and very urgent and very important challenges. So, for example, we need to change dietary advice to the public, so that it's not just saying how much protein we need, how much fat we need, but where we should derive this stuff from, and what the effects are going to be on the environment. We need to shift the way that we pay our taxes and charge our taxes, away from things like hard work, for example, income tax. Why not shift that onto taxing highly polluting, highly damaging environmental activities. There doesn't need to be a change in the overall tax system. We just need to send the right signals in the right directions. We need to stop subsidizing intensive agriculture. You know, it's crazy that a packet of popcorn costs less than an ear of natural corn. You know, why is that? It's because oil is free. And if producing food is about turning oil into food, which is what it's become, it makes no sense just to allow people to extract oil from the ground and pollute the atmosphere without charging them for it. So we need to shift our subsidies, we need to shift taxes, we need to purchase responsibly, and I would urge everybody to support the second reading of the public procurement bill coming up on the 12th of this month. And finally, we need to work with the retailers and the processors all together. We have a process at WWF called Tasting the Future, where we've actually invited people from governments. All but one of the big supermarkets are there, big food producers, academics, people from civil society, and we are working together to look at the systemic barriers. What's actually stopping us doing this? And why can't we even talk about it? And now we're talking about it, we're working on solutions, and I very much hope to be standing here in a year or two's time and showing you some of the results of that work. And if it does work, hopefully we can turn this back into this on an ongoing basis. Thank you very much.